Committee is now called to order. I want to thank you, Clement. Appreciate you and Katrina for all of the work you've done to make this hearing and many other hearings possible. We couldn't make it without you. The subcommittee is now in order, and without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess of the subcommittee at any time. Objection, members of the full committee not on this subcommittee are authorized to participate in today's hearing. Members are reminded to keep their video function on at all times, even when they're not recognized by the chair. Members are also reminded that they're responsible for muting and unmuting themselves and to mute themselves after they are finished speaking. Consistent with the regulations accompanying HR's 965, staff will only mute members and witnesses as appropriate when not recognized to avoid inadvertent background noise. Members are reminded that all rules relating to order and decorum apply to this remote hearing. Members are reminded that this hearing is entitled Paycheck Security, Economic Perspectives on Alternative Approaches to Protecting Workers' Pay During COVID-19. I now recognize myself for 4 minutes to give an opening statement. In February, before a pandemic was declared and the economic livelihood of Americans was placed in peril, I sent a letter asking the White House, Treasury Department, and the Federal Reserve how they plan to prevent a crisis from occurring due to COVID-19. I asked them how their strategy was to help protect American health and the national security economics. It was months until that letter I wrote with Chairman Meeks, Green, and Clay would receive a response. Unfortunately, by that time, it was clear, at least to me, that there was no plan. Because we did not plan, we have become a part of the virus's plan. Congress was forced to take unprecedented steps to rescue our economy and provide emergency assistance to American families and frontline workers through the CARES Act. We provided nearly every American money to feed their families. We rushed resources for COVID-19 testing and personal protective equipment, PPE, to hospitals. We created the Paycheck Protection Program as a short-term lifeline to keep small businesses alive and their employees on the rolls. Just last week, we heard from Chairman Powell that the CARES Act was able to, and I quote, provide direct help to people, businesses, and communities, unquote, and made a, I quote again, critical difference, unquote. It prevented the kind of mass layoffs and evictions that threatened millions and millions of Americans. Despite that significant bill, it has become profoundly clear that our initial response will not be enough and was not administered the way we intended. The U.S. has suffered the largest increase in unemployment of any major economy on the planet. The unemployment rate was over 13% in May and more than 16% after accounting for various measurement issues, and closer to 20% when workers with reduced hours are included. Additionally, the clock is ticking on the expiration of many provisions of the CARES Act, as economists and public health experts are telling us that the outlook is getting worse. This week, in a report written by Moody's chief economist, Mark Zandi, he highlighted that the prospects are high that we will suffer what may well be considered an economic depression. His analysis leverages Federal Reserve and Congressional Budget Office's research that initially assumed COVID-19 would be tapering off and double-digit unemployment would persist into next year. However, with a resurgence of COVID-19 around the United States in Florida, Texas, Georgia, and my home state of Missouri, businesses are being forced to shutter again, driving a possible second round of economic catastrophe. Throughout the course of this crisis, both the economic and health consequences of COVID-19 has fallen disproportionately on low and middle income families and communities of color. The Inspector General for the SBA highlighted that the CARES Act required rural, minority, and women-owned businesses be prioritized for PPP loans, but based on their analysis, they were not. By mid-April, 440,000 Black business owners had shuttered their company for good, a 41% plunge. By comparison, 17% of white-owned businesses closed during that same period. The New York Times successfully sued the CDC to release a COVID-19 information based on ethnicity and race, and learned last week that Blacks and Latinos were 3 times more likely to be infected with COVID-19 and twice as likely to die. When you combine these facts with data from the Brookings Institute that low-income communities of color are more likely to serve as essential frontline workers with higher rates of exposure, this second dangerous wave could be cataclysmic for the working poor in our country. The remedy that Mark Zandi prescribed in his report, which is echoed by the Federal Reserve Chairman, many of our witnesses today, and even by President Trump, is simple. There is a need for more congressional action that places employees first. The HEROES Act, which passed our House in May and is waiting in the Senate, will go a long way in preventing the kind of catastrophe that leading economists are predicting. Further, a bill sponsored by my friend Congresswoman Jayapal, the Paycheck Recovery Act of 2020, would go a long way in aiding those who need it most. Congresswoman Jayapal has offered a statement which I would like to enter into the record. I will now recognize the ranking member, Mr. McHenry, for 5 minutes. Mr. McHenry.
No, thank you for the recognition. My understanding was it was a shorter period of time, but I will thank you for yielding. First, let me say thank you for yielding, and thank you for being a good leader on this committee. The frustrating part is to listen to the opening statement and to recognize this serves as a legislative hearing on a bill that represents what is absolutely wrong with this Congress and some of my Democrat colleagues' response to COVID-19. They want to be hyper-partisan rather than trying to remake the bipartisan success of the CARES Act. Rather than coordinate between the House and the Senate and the White House, what they want to do is just up the ante because they view it as good politics. And I got to tell you, responding to the American people's concerns is the best way for us to be good stewards of the taxpayer and also good stewards to our constituents. And so through that bipartisan success of the CARES Act, we've deployed rapid support to our fellow Americans. The administration has done a great job of implementing it. And we have portions of America that are reopening. We still have enormous challenges ahead. And that is the reason why we should continue our bipartisan work. Instead, we're here today considering a partisan COVID response bill by a far left progressive member that seeks to hold American workers and employees hostage unless they consent to a laundry list of unpopular social mandates from the far left wing. This bill that this hearing's about was so far to the left that it wasn't even part of that left-wing package called the HEROES Act, that a couple of Democrats weren't even willing to go along with that partisan approach. This bill is nothing more than protecting Democrats' left flanks. Instead, we should get serious about crafting legislation that will get the American people back to work, grow our economy, not codify a partisan wish list. So this is quite frustrating as a policymaker that we're wasting this committee's time by having a hearing like this when we should be crafting and working through the things that are going to make a very good impact and get people back to work, keep people safe and healthy. And I think that should be our focus rather than really a laundry list of left-wing ideas that this hearing is about. And so let's stay focused on getting American people back to work. Let's not focus on social mandates and extraneous partisan measures. And let's get back to the work that the American people want us focused on. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McHenry. I did yield you too much time, not that you used it all. So I apologize that we didn't present you with less time, but nonetheless, we will now go to the ranking member of this subcommittee, Mr. Hill. You need to, we can't hear you.
Thanks, Mr. Cleaver. Appreciate you convening this virtual hearing and appreciate this distinguished list of witnesses for their expertise. Today, we're discussing the Paycheck Security topic with a specific focus on HR 6918, the Paycheck Recovery Act of 2020, sponsored by Representative Jayapal, which would require the Treasury Secretary to provide grants to small businesses that have been impacted by COVID-19. Before making my comments on the legislation, I too want to make some procedural comments. This legislation should not be moving through this committee, let alone this subcommittee. The essence of this bill is to create a grant paycheck protection program for small businesses, which implies that the Small Business Committee should be managing this effort. I understand the bill was referred to our committee as it involves the Treasury. However, we're using our very limited subcommittee time to discuss a partisan bill sponsored by a member not on this committee. It's just disappointing that there are plenty of bipartisan bills that we should notice and have influence over our direct work in international institutions, sanctions, and monetary policy. Now, let me turn my attention to the topic of the hearing at hand. The federal government responded to COVID-19 by authorizing nearly $2 trillion of direct spending, 65% of what we spend in a full year, including $454 billion to the Treasury's Exchange Stabilization Fund, which can be leveraged up to 10 times. Therefore, we have nearly $7 trillion, Mr. Chairman, of resources available to help get our economy back to full capacity as we fight together this virus, almost 35% of GDP. All that said, the money is still flowing, and before we start creating new programs, we ought to assess the current programs that we have and the amount of money that we've gotten out into the economy. HR 6918 would create a program at Treasury to provide grants to small businesses. As a former Treasury official, I've long opposed Treasury becoming just another program agency in the cabinet. And if we've learned anything about the CARES Act that we passed, the government is not always well equipped to carry out programs on a broad-based scale. Look at the PPP program, how it's operated versus the Emergency Injury Disaster Loan Program. Using the banks, the PPP program, while not perfect, got over $500 billion of assistance out to our small businesses, preserving millions of jobs in just a month, whereas the Emergency Disaster Loan Program still suffers from a bureaucratic approach that has limited its effectiveness. The PPP program, Mr. Chairman, has $134 billion of available funding. Let's focus on improving that program to help our small businesses over the next weeks to come. And let's fix the EIDL program in the right way. Further, I'd like to mention the role state and local governments play. Our state of Arkansas used CARES Act funding to set up its own program for small businesses, the Arkansas Ready for Business Grant Program. It received over 2,300 applicants within 1 hour and helped over 200,000 Arkansas employees across the state stay at work. 94% of those businesses had 50 employees or less, and a quarter were minority owned and women owned. So, Mr. Chairman, I think we have the solutions here to help our small businesses. Guidance to our state and local government, and let's fix the EIDL program and the PPP program so that more small businesses can be helped as we continue to fight this terrible virus across our country. Thank you for the time, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. The chair today, I want to apologize again for the mismanagement of the time early on with you and Mr. McHenry. Today, we welcome the testimony of Ms. Lisa Cook, Ms. Lily Garcia, Mr. Joseph Stiglitz, and Mr. Zuluaga. Ms. Cook is a professor of economics and international relations at Michigan State University and is a member of the American Economic Association's Executive Committee. Previously, she served as a senior economist in the Obama administration's Council of Economic Advisors. As an authority on international economics, she has also advised policymakers from the Nigerian and Rwanda governments. Thank you for appearing before this committee. Next, we have Ms. Lily Garcia. Ms. Garcia is the president of the National Education Association, the largest union in the United States. Prior to holding this position, she served as the NEA's Secretary Treasurer, and Vice President. A lifelong educator and advocate, Ms. Garcia has served as a member of the Clinton administration's White House strategy session on improving Hispanic education and was named a member of the President's Advisory Commission on Educational Excellence for Hispanics. Today, thank you for appearing before the committee. Next, we have Mr. Joseph Stiglitz. Mr. Stiglitz is an economist and professor at Columbia University. He was the chief economist of the World Bank and chair of President Clinton's Council on Economic Advisors. He is the founder of the Initiative for Policy Dialogue, a think tank on international development, and he is the recipient of the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Science and the prestigious John Bates Clark Medal. Thank you for appearing. And then finally, we have Mr. Diego Zuluaga, who is the Associate Director of Financial Regulation Studies at the Cato Institute's Center for Monetary and Financial Alternatives. Prior to holding this position, he was the head of the Financial Services and Tech Policy at the Institute of Economic Affairs in London. He has written on a variety of financial regulatory topics, and his work has been featured in a number of reputable media publications. Thank you for appearing before this committee. Witnesses are reminded that your oral testimony will be limited to 5 minutes. A chime will go off at the end of your time, and I will ask that you respect the members and other witnesses' time by wrapping up your oral testimony as quickly as possible. Without objection, your written statement will be made a part of the record. Ms. Cook, you're now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Cleaver, Ranking Member Hill, and members of the Subcommittee of the National Security, International Development, and Monetary Policy. The coronavirus pandemic and the resulting human, economic, and financial crises are unfolding at breakneck speed. Nonetheless, the rent and bills of Americans were and are still due. The quick action of Congress has gone a considerable way to lessen or postpone the pain associated with this pandemic-induced recession. Specifically, these measures, including adding $600 per week to unemployment checks, providing assistance to small businesses through the PPP, and giving Americans a direct payment of $1,200. With an unemployment rate of 11%, we have now entered the history books with the second highest unemployment rate than at any other time since 1940. The unemployment rate for African Americans is 15.4%, and for Hispanic Americans is 14.5%. These data are especially disturbing because Black and Hispanic wealth fell significantly during the Great Recession, making it more difficult to weather the COVID recession. By early June, 44% of adult Latino renters and 41% of Black renters, compared to 21% of white renters, reported not being able to pay their rent. 20% of rental households face eviction by September 30th. A wave of bankruptcies could ensue if small businesses cannot stay afloat, renters cannot pay their rent, and landlords cannot pay their mortgages. Early evidence shows that the direct federal payments of up to $1,200 per adult and $500 per child are a critical first lifeline for many households and the U.S. economy, allowing them to purchase food and pay their bills. To minimize the likelihood that a liquidity crisis for these households becomes a bankruptcy crisis for them and for the economy, Congress should authorize another round of direct payments along with extended unemployment benefits. By mid-June, of the businesses that were listed on Yelp, 140,000 of those closing since March 1st were closed by mid-June. 35% of shopping and retail businesses listed had closed their doors permanently. 53% of restaurants listed had closed their doors permanently. 41% of African American businesses reporting being closed compared to 35% overall. In the only survey providing demographic data on PPP loan recipients, the Color of Change reports that 45% of Black and Latino businesses will close by the end of the year without more relief. Prior to reopening, states that received more PPP loans and with more generous unemployment benefits had less severe declines and faster recoveries. Macroeconomists are expecting a slower recovery. Given that consumer spending is 70% of GDP, it is clear that more and extended help to the American people and small businesses will be urgently needed. I agree with the Economic Security Project and colleagues who signed their letter that regular, lasting, direct stimulus payments would be a critical part of ensuring the economic recovery does not grind to a halt. In addition, more aid to state and local governments is desperately needed now to continue to fight the pandemic and to prepare for job losses stemming from impending austerity budgets being adopted by state and local governments. This relief should be directed at healthcare providers, community colleges, universities, mental health and other social services, universal broadband, and the arts. Any and all relief to the American people should be authorized and dispersed with all deliberate speed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Ms. Garcia, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Cleaver and Ranking Member Hill and all of the members of the committee. This is an important opportunity, and I really appreciate your time. My name is Lily Eskelsen Garcia. I am a sixth grade teacher from Utah, and I am the current president of the National Education Association, the NEA. And as NEA's president, I am honored to represent more than 3 million educators, teachers, education support professionals, specialized instructional staff, K-12 schools, preschool to graduate school, including university and college campuses. NEA also represents educators in the Department of Defense schools, college students who are planning to become educators, those student teachers, retired educators, and public employees in local and state government. I am so proud, but I'm not the least bit surprised how NEA members have risen to this moment, demonstrated resilience, creativity, teamwork, as we have tried to cultivate in our students those same characteristics. We have been called on to organize car caravans through student neighborhoods to deliver a message. Even though our school building is closed, we're still learning. We're still here for you. We've helped parents who overnight had to become their kids' substitute teachers. And I've had more than one of my members who has cried with me over how worried they are about their students because school was the only stable place in their lives. And as we speak today, governors and mayors are taking note of very steep budget cuts that are going to harm our students. This is the result of the pandemic, not someone who didn't plan for something no one even knew would come. Without federal assistance, we're going to see massive educator layoffs, and that's going to be incredibly harsh, especially for those who struggle most to make ends meet, even during normal times, such as our wonderful, amazingly devoted education support professionals. These are the lunch ladies, the school bus drivers, the maintenance staff. Many of these workers stayed on the job, putting themselves in harm's way to deliver meals to students and families, to drop off work packets to students, to keep our schools sanitized and safe. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, nearly 900,000 public education jobs have already been lost because of budget cuts. By comparison, more than 350,000 education jobs were lost due to the Great Recession. In other words, COVID-19 has done more damage in 3 months than a recession that lasted for a year and a half did. If this damage goes unchecked, nearly 2 million educators could lose their jobs over the next few years. According to NEA's analysis, and we studied the same numbers that school boards are receiving all over the country, this could represent 1/5 of the entire workforce that powers public schools and higher education institutions. The COVID-19 recession could be 6 times worse for education than the 2008 financial crisis. Our nation now has 1.4 million more K-12 students than we had in 2008, but we have 135,000 fewer educators than we had 12 years ago. These layoffs could stem from pandemic-related budget cuts. It's just going to worsen an already dire situation. No community is going to go unaffected, but the schools in wealthy communities are more likely to weather this storm, while schools in poorer communities that are already struggling might not. Job losses in these schools would profoundly affect low-income students whose schools rely on Title I funding to reduce class size, hire specialists, and offer a rich curriculum. We know that we're going to need more, and we thank the House for taking the bold action to pass the HEROES Act. We call on Mitch McConnell in the Senate to please abandon the wait and see till we get around to it approach. The Senate needs to hit the panic button. And I thank you for your time. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Garcia. I now recognize Mr. Stiglitz for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Sad to say, the U.S. response to COVID-19 has been disappointing. We've done a much poorer job than other countries, both in maintaining the health of our country and that of the economy. And the two are related. There will not be a strong recovery until the pandemic is brought under control. Congress responded to the pandemic with a massive amount of assistance. It succeeded in preventing much suffering that would otherwise have occurred. But in many ways, the programs were badly designed and badly implemented, with much of the money not going to where it was most needed, with the unemployment rate soaring far higher than elsewhere. This put strains on our unemployment insurance system, resulting in many of the unemployed not receiving money for weeks and weeks. The increase in unemployment is especially inopportune in the United States because so many depend on employer-provided health insurance. Losing health coverage in the midst of a pandemic is a calamity. The program of assistance was predicated on there being a short shutdown. In other words, a V-shaped recovery. Such beliefs appear now to be utter fantasy. With the pandemic continuing apace, no one thinks that we will be back to normal by the end of the month. There are a few principles and priorities that should guide the next package of assistance. First, because we cannot have a healthy economy without a healthy population, health should be given priority. While some of the earlier programs did this, there are important lacunae. It was, for instance, foolish, short-sighted, and unconscionable not to have ensured that everyone was provided with paid sick leave. We don't want people with the disease going to work and spreading the disease. But with so many Americans living paycheck to paycheck, it was inevitable that would happen without paid sick leave. As another example, there are likely to be large increases in demand for Medicaid, and the states will be suffering large losses in tax revenue, as was just pointed out. With states having balanced budget frameworks, only the federal government can help them meet these needs. Secondly, hysteresis effects are enormous. Bankrupt firms don't become unbankrupt when the pandemic is over. Balance sheets of households and firms often take a long time to recover. That's why you did the right thing in responding quickly and massively. But all these investments in our future will be for naught if assistance is not continued so long as the pandemic and its economic aftermath persists. There's a third powerful force that will depress the economy: precautionary behavior. As long as there is uncertainty, both about the course of the disease and the economy, there will be a reluctance to spend, either by firms or households. In the previous downturns, like that of 2008, we provided assurances to workers that there would be extended UI so long as the unemployment rate remained elevated. We need to do that now, and we have to provide similar assurances for all of the other critical assistance that we provided. We also need to provide income contingent loans where repayments and the duration of the loan automatically adjust to the circumstances of the economy and the firm, providing an automatic stabilizer to the economy. Thus, there must be a commitment, in the famous words of Mario Draghi, to do what it takes. But at the same time, we must spend our money well, which is why the design of the program is so important. As I wrote in my Roosevelt Institute policy brief in April, even before the passage of the CARES Act, the alternative approach of direct payments to employers to retain workers seemed more likely to be more effective than the disparate programs included in that bill. The evidence over the last few weeks seems consistent with those expectations, and the evidence since then, both in those countries around the world that adopted these programs, and let me emphasize, these are not left-wing countries, that adopted programs similar to HR 6918, the bipartisan Paycheck Recovery Act, and the United States, which took an alternative course, strongly reinforced the conclusion I had reached at that time. With the forecast I made then that additional funding would be needed and that the PPP program would not be as effective as had been hoped, have unfortunately more than fully realized. I went on to argue that the Paycheck Recovery Program represents a significant improvement over the existing PPP. It is simpler to administer, with more of the money going to where it is needed, and considerably less costly and more effective. Some will say, yes, we should have adopted the Paycheck Guarantee Program, but that's water over the dam. It's now too late. That argument might have had some validity if, as thought at the time, these measures were adopted, the pandemic had been of short duration. But since then, it has flared up, and there's good chance that it will be with us for a long time. As I've already said, we will need to maintain some kind of support, and this program is the best way forward. Among the virtues of the program I cited is its transparency, its administrability, its comprehensiveness, its parking the money where it's needed, it's prescribing important links between workers and employers, its ability to deliver money in a timely way, its role as an automatic stabilizer. I want to conclude with two more general comments. First, our assistance to the economy has to be far more comprehensive. There were some important sectors that did not receive the assistance that they needed. One sector is states and localities. I already referred to the severe budgetary constraints that they faced. These authorities are responsible for many of the services on which so many of our citizens depend, including education, which has just been discussed, health, and welfare. But cutbacks in spending will greatly weaken our economy with large multiplier effects. It is austerity from below. In previous downturns, we have seen the devastating macroeconomic effects. Already, layoffs of government workers are among the large sources of increasing unemployment. We will not have a robust recovery without adequate support for this vital sector of our economy. One of the virtues of the Paycheck Recovery Act is that it allows states and localities to access grants. Secondly, our aspiration should not be a recovery in which some say in 2022, when we get back to where we were in late 2019, we simply pick up where we left off. Never has government played such a role in the economy, not even in the Great Recession. Citizens have the right to—
Time, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Stiglitz, thank you. Thank you very kindly. I appreciate it. Mr. Zuluaga, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Cleaver, Ranking Member Hill, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. My name is Diego Zuluaga, and I am the Associate Director of Financial Regulation Studies at the Cato Institute. America's 30.7 million small businesses have taken a very severe hit from the COVID-19 pandemic. The share of small businesses reporting that the health emergency has had a large negative effect on them was 37.7% in late June, down just 14 percentage points from 8 weeks earlier. Another survey found in April that 1.8% of small businesses had permanently closed because of the pandemic, which, if true, would mean that more than 550,000 firms are gone forever. Yet economic activity and employment are so far recovering faster than many expected. Early action to support small businesses through the Paycheck Protection Program has helped. According to my estimates, around 77% of small businesses with employees had gotten a PPP loan by June 30th. And while the proportion of employing small businesses with a PPP loan varies considerably across states, Nowhere is it below 60%. By allowing millions of small businesses to keep paying their workers, as well as utility and rent bills, the Paycheck Protection Program has prevented a greater destruction of livelihoods and valuable business relationships than has actually happened. It doesn't follow, however, that a program of grants based on lost revenue will assist the recovery. I believe, on the contrary, that it will hinder the recovery by delaying businesses' necessary adaptation to changing consumer demand. The pandemic has not just caused all sorts of businesses to suffer losses, it has also led to permanent changes in economic activity, mainly because production processes and consumer preferences have shifted in response to new health risks. Restaurants are cooking more meals for takeaway and outdoor consumption. More retail activity is moving online, as are larger transactions such as home purchases. These changes are unavoidable and permanent. Any recession involves the reallocation of workers across firms and industries. But because of the pandemic's wide-ranging consequences, recovery from the present recession will likely involve a larger redeployment of workers and capital than previous downturns. Attempting to freeze America's productive structure in its pre-COVID-19 state will therefore only delay the return to full employment and steady growth. The bounce back will be swifter, on the other hand, the more quickly businesses adapt to the new conditions. I don't at all mean to suggest that government policy can't play any additional valuable role, but it can best do so by removing barriers to geographic mobility and business investment. Instead of rigid support programs that impede mobility and risk prolonging financial insecurity, workers need flexible support in the face of uncertain economic conditions. A program of direct grants to cash-strapped households, whether or not their members are employed, would address paycheck insecurity while preserving the incentive to adapt to the post-pandemic economy. A conditional grant program, on the other hand, would tie up capital and labor in firms whose long-term viability is far from assured. Besides delaying adaptation, conditional grant programs are costly to administer, as officials must verify applicants' declarations and monitor the use of funds. These programs also raise fairness concerns. Why should laid-off employees who find new work not be entitled to a reward, whereas those lucky enough to keep their job get a bonus? Why should taxpayers support businesses while the national unemployment rate remains above a threshold, but not thereafter? Macroeconomic arguments about supporting demand are unpersuasive, since direct, unconditional cash grants would have at least the same effect on demand, for two reasons. First, a larger share of available funds would go to recipients instead of program administrators. And second, because grant funds would go to the least well-off, regardless of employment status, and the least well-off consume more of their disposable income, the immediate impact on aggregate demand might be greater. Congressional action to support the solvency of small businesses in the direst weeks of the pandemic has enabled a speedier recovery than many expected. Now, the goal should be to encourage adaptation so American workers and businesses can resume productive activity. Achieving this goal will require their ingenuity, on which we can count, but also flexible, change-friendly support from policymakers. Thank you. I will be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. This morning, I got up to news that Mexico is now closing some of its borders to the United States because we are losing this battle with COVID-19, and apparently we're losing worse than anybody else. And if if we believe we're losing and it's okay, then we'll never win. But I'm troubled by what I'm seeing and reading, and it's probably a little embarrassing, it should be, to the whole country. But the New York Times headlines yesterday read, "European workers draw paychecks and American workers scrounge for food." Dr. Stiglitz, you are, a renowned economist and former chief economist, and you have had some outspoken comments on this whole issue of COVID-19 and the crisis that it's created for the United States, and comparing them to others. Do you believe that Mark Zandi's report assessment that the prospects are high that we may suffer from an economic depression? What's your analysis of his analysis? unmute.
Okay. Yes, I am very concerned. The fact, as I said in my testimony, is we're not getting a V-shaped recovery, and even moderate economists, like the head of the chairman of the Federal Reserve, do not think we're going to be back to where we were at the end of 2019 until sometime in 2022. If we do everything right, and if we don't do things right, if we follow Herbert Hoover and don't provide the assistance the economy needs, then we're setting ourselves up for another depression, for a severe economic downturn.
Thank you. I'm, somebody said that now I guess Mexico will build a wall to protect itself from us. So I guess something good can come out of something bad. But I'd like to know, Miss Lilly, what's going on with educators? How are they faring in this COVID-19 world? What kind of difficulties are they experiencing? And what are the prospects you think of opening schools in September under the current year?
You can't see the back of our head. We've been pulling our hair out for like 4 months now. And we are so frustrated. We love our students. I'm a 6th grade teacher. I had 39 kids in my room, 39 12-year-olds one year. That was not healthy on the best day of the year, but we've got millions now facing overcrowded classrooms, trying to figure out how do you make that work coming back in the fall. When they told us to leave the building, it was like someone pulled the fire alarm. Everybody like grabbed what they could, ran out, and the next day we were trying to figure out how we could deliver to 52 million public school students reading, writing, and arithmetic online. It has been incredibly challenging. Under the best of circumstances, it's frustrating. That's when you've got Wi-Fi in the home and mom and dad have a laptop or a tablet, and it's just kind of annoying. But it can be alarming when you get into communities of poverty, where the only technology in some homes was mom's telephone. And she took it with her to work because she stocked shelves in a grocery store. And the kids didn't even have adult supervision in their home. And so our members, these are America's educators, have said, we raced out and had to make up things and do the best we could to have a meaningful educational experience for our students. But now they're alarmed because they see politicians. I know I'm talking to some politicians here, but they see people who are making decisions to race back into that school without the proper plan to distance, to disinfect, to have the PPE, to have the health checks and the COVID testing. And it's like, no, we have to warehouse those kids, put those 39 kids back into my classroom. And don't worry
Yeah.
that somehow they'll be at risk, or put their own families at risk, put their teachers and the lunch lady and the janitor at risk. And
No,
so
thank you.
we are scared. We're scared.
Yeah, understandably. Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Mr. Hill for 5 minutes. Ranking member.
Thank you, Chairman. Appreciate our witnesses. Very interesting discussion. Mr. Zuluaga, would you tell me what you think, having watched the PPP program put out $500 billion into the economy, helping millions of people stay employed? Here in Arkansas, it was $3.5 billion for about 40,000 businesses. We have $134 billion left in that program. With work in the House and work in the Senate, we extended that date now to August 8th, which I want to thank Marco Rubio for his leadership and thank my friends in the House for not blocking that earlier in the week, last week. What should we change in that program to make it more helpful to people who are still fighting various shutdown issues in some states while others are doing better? You know, what should we change in that program?
I think additional flexibility in terms of the timing within which the funds can be spent would be quite helpful, as would probably adjusting the percentages that may be allocated to the different types of expenses authorized. Increasingly, it seems that it's going to take longer for the pandemic to get resolved, and maybe the timing is different in different states. And as a result of that, it would be useful to give funds that, for example, help businesses change their premises to become safer for what's to come over the next few months, at least before we have a vaccine. In addition to that, I would say that what's left of the PPP is about proportional to the share of employing small businesses that haven't got a PPP loan just yet. So, there's still funding available, and I think that program has worked well so far.
If a business was still significantly down because they're in a hot spot and in trouble, and say revenues are still down 50% or something off, would you allow a business to go back and get a second PPP loan?
I would, because I think the key distinction here is between a supply shock, something that makes a business that is otherwise perfectly viable and has the same customer base as it did before, from being able to be in business as a result of a new outbreak or because there's a second wave or something like that. Distinguish that from a demand shock, which is when the longer this goes on and the more people change work, the more people decide to move from cities to the suburbs or to other parts of the country, the more the changes in demand and industrial patterns become permanent. And in that case, sustaining existing industrial structure is counterproductive because you don't get the adaptation that needs to happen.
And in the issue of the $600 of unemployment compensation that's on top of the state's existing unemployment compensation benefits, members are really looking at how should that be extended or modified before the end of the month. This is an important component of the next legislative effort that we collectively make, hopefully on a bipartisan basis. What are your thoughts about the unemployment compensation, the pandemic piece, the $600 extra per week?
I think it's still unclear as to whether there is a disincentive effect in raising the unemployment benefit in, for example, making the PPP work. Because in some places and for some businesses, it became more attractive for workers to earn unemployment benefits than to remain and work, particularly given the insecurity of going to work in the midst of a pandemic. So I think even though it may be well-intentioned to boost those incomes, it's probably more helpful to have a direct support that is regardless of your employment status, because in that case, you don't get those incentive effects. And from the analysis I've done of the PPP program so far, it seems to be the case that in some states, take-up of PPP was less, and there was a relationship with those boosted unemployment benefits.
Yeah, thank you for that. Ms. Garcia, I want to thank you for your leadership at the NEA. I spend a lot of time talking to my teachers, and there's nothing more fun than sixth graders. I don't know if I want 39 of them for all day, but I want to thank you for leading the NEA this year and helping be a constructive voice to try to find bipartisan support for what our teachers need to go back to the classroom. Would you agree, though, that we really need to get kids back in school and that it's better in so many ways? Do you agree with that?
There is no parent, no Republican parent, no Democratic parent that wants their kid in an unsafe situation. And so here's the good news. We don't have to do it in an unsafe way. They keep asking me the question. They'll say, all right, overcrowded classrooms, we need hand sanitizers and we need PPE and we need all of these things, while we're talking about laying off maybe almost 2 million educators, where that's unimaginable. But they said, so obviously we have to talk about whether we should close that unsafe school or open that unsafe school. Wrong choices. We need to make those schools safe. We need to make sure we have everything that teacher needs, that the parents want to keep those kids safe.
Right. Thank you so much.
Actually, Mr. Hill, if you'd like to proceed with another question, please feel free to do so. We went along a bit longer earlier, so you're welcome to go ahead with another question if you had.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
All right, thank you. Mr. Perlmutter, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to Mr. Zuluaga, I think you were saying two things, and I kind of agreed with both of them, even though they're opposite of one another. And you said the PPP has generally been pretty good, and I would agree. And that it ought to be extended, and some people ought to get a second loan. And maybe I agree with that. And I should just let you know, I practiced bankruptcy law, business bankruptcy law for 25 years before I got elected to Congress. And what I'm worried about is you say, well, it's the demand shock. Now, economists have, the advantage of hindsight as to what the demand shock is. We're seeing unavoidable permanent changes, but you really don't know it for a while. So I'm worried that we're going to continue to throw good money after bad with respect to a lot of businesses that aren't going to make it, no matter what we want to do. So I want to so I agree with some of your statements, and I appreciate the desire to, tap into ingenuity and improvisation and innovation. That's all right. But we're in an emergency situation right now. We came through 3 months of hell, and we got some ahead of us. So, Mr. Stiglitz, you didn't get to finish your statement. I want to hear your closing remarks. And then I've got some questions for Ms. Garcia and Ms. Cook.
Well, thank you very much for giving me this chance to finish. What I wanted to say is that we needed to have a vision of what kind of economy we want coming out. And agreeing with what's been said, there's going to be structural changes. We're going to be worried about another pandemic. I mean, those are some of the examples. The aviation sector is going to be weaker. But as we think about providing money, we ought to be thinking about how do we move the economy to the future economy. Part of that is we want to have more of a knowledge sector. That's one of the, our comparative advantage as an economy is our technology. It's really what makes us strong. And one of the very disturbing aspects of what's happened is we haven't given support to our knowledge sector, to the education. We heard about from Lily about how the number of teachers has gone down. Our universities are being devastated. All the sources of their revenues are going down. The decision yesterday of ICE to make it more difficult for foreign students to come to the United States, one of the things that has made us strong is having the best talented people come to the United States and often stay to study and start a lot of our new enterprises. We're making that extraordinarily difficult. ICE has just made it a policy statement that makes it very difficult for them to stay here on their visas. So what I wanted to urge, as you think about spending money, have a comprehensive view, making sure that no sector is devastated, and that we have a vision of what kind of economy that we want emerging in 2022.
Okay, thank you very much. So to Ms. Garcia, Ms. Cook, my wife is a NEA lifetime retired, and she's been called back 3 times, and she's making a list of things that she thinks as a math teacher in high school need to be done for her to be able to teach and deal with the potentials of the virus. But she also knows tax revenue is way down, state, local, and school districts. So I'll start with Ms. Cook. You were talking about a number of the things to try to avoid a wave of bankruptcy. I think they're coming anyway. But I feel like we really have to support our state, local, and school districts, or we're going to hit a wall at, by the end of this summer. How would you react to that? And you need to unmute. Uh-oh. We can't hear you. Ms. Garcia? Ms. Cook, I'm not sure what's going on with your audio.
Ms. Cook?
We can talk about it offline.
Okay.
Now, I'm just worried we're going to hit a brick wall at the end of this month to all of our economists and to the head of the NEA. When the unemployment runs out, when state and local and school districts are broke, we got problems and huge layoffs, and we're going to have to deal with it. And I will yield back to the chair.
Mr. Perlmutter, we had a technical problem, so please, if Ms. Cook, if you'd like to respond to Mr. Perlmutter's question, please proceed. I'm doing this a little bit lax because we're still experimenting with things. So, Ms. Cook, please.
And you'll need to unmute. I'm not hearing anything, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Cook, if you could hear me.
There you go. There you go. There you go.
Okay. So I absolutely agree with you. We want to avoid the problems that we saw in the Great Recession. The fiscal cliff that led to so much pain, so much suffering, so much unemployment because state and local governments laid off so many people because we didn't come to help, because Congress didn't come to help, because there wasn't enough aid. And all of the problems that we're talking about, from the schools to the universities to community colleges to the arts, all of these, and certainly healthcare workers, all of these support the economy. This is 70% of GDP. It's consumer spending. All of them need support. And I think it would be foolhardy to think that they that are adopting austerity budgets, the state and local governments that are adopting austerity budgets, that they won't follow through. They have a hard budget constraint. So I think that this aid has to be quick. It has to be now. And this is learning the lessons of 2008, 2009. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas and Missouri, Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you bringing everybody together today, and thanks to all the witnesses. And we saw some promising economic data come out last week with over 4.8 million jobs being added to the economy during this month of June. We still have a long way to go before we are back to pre-pandemic levels, but the data that looks like the economy is bouncing back sooner than many people have predicted. Unfortunately, the legislation that is attached to this hearing today, the Paycheck Recovery Act by Congressman J. Paul, is not a realistic path forward that would help continue this growth trend. The bill contains such a radical proposal that they were not even, as we've heard, included in the $3 trillion Partisan Heroes Act that was passed in May. So, Mr. Zuluaga, do you think that drastic new government interventions would be the best way to get our economy to recover quickly?
I don't think it would help. The thing I think that we need the most right now is flexibility. We've seen from the start of the pandemic that relaxing regulations about, for example, occupational licensing or the practice of telemedicine, or where one can purchase different types of food and drink, that all of those things are helpful in terms of getting the economy moving, even in the context of a lot of uncertainty about the future. And to the extent that you are introducing new rigidities by tying support to one's pre-pandemic employment status, I think that can make recovery more difficult, and it can make people's financial position more precarious rather than more assured.
Okay. So we've heard everyone talking about the need for another aid package. That's constantly what we hear to come through Congress before August. However, Congress, as we've said, has already allocated 2.2 trillion from the CARES Act and other bills that we've passed relating to the coronavirus. The Paycheck Protection Plan program, as we know, still has over $130 billion that is currently untapped. So again, Mr. Zuluaga, how should Congress be looking at the economy to make sure that the industries in most need of assistance receive it, while the other money we have already injected in the economy makes its way into the system?
I would pay attention to where the need is, particularly in terms of local shutdowns of activity or places where the pandemic has had a resurgence at the state level. I think it is useful because that's an indicator that activity has stopped because of a health emergency rather than because of the response, the medium-term or longer-term response to the health emergency. As you indicated, there's still funding left over in the PPP. And I mentioned earlier how additional flexibility in terms of how one can spend amounts and so forth could be helpful.
Okay. Small business owners, of which I am one, I've been a small business owner and still am for 50 years, are the engines of job growth of our economy. Unfortunately, I have heard from many businesses across Texas that they are concerned that they're going to be sued if they attempt to reopen and some individuals get the coronavirus, even if they follow all of the state and local, federal safety guidelines. We need to pass liability protections in the next coronavirus relief bill that is so that this economic recovery will not be hijacked by trial lawyers. I believe this is the major thing we have to do as we move forward. So again, Mr. Zuluaga, how important is passing liability protections to protect business who are trying to open safely to getting our economy back on track?
Congressman, thank you for the question, but I'm not a lawyer, so I cannot respond with expertise. I would say that, as with other areas, having flexibility here for employers, particularly those operating in good faith, is essential to speeding up the recovery.
Well, I think our economy can and will get going. I'm one of those that thinks we could see growth in the fourth quarter and actually into next year even better. But I will say that liability protection is important. Regardless what the business it is, because if people are going to get back to hiring people and getting the income going, Main Street America deserves that liability protection. So I think it's very, very important. With that in mind, Mr. Chairman, I yield my time back.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. The chair now recognizes Mr. Himes for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses today. Very interesting and important conversation given the ongoing difficulties in the economy. I was a little sad to hear my Republican colleagues say that Ms. Jayapal's proposal is somehow way out there on the fringe. It simply gives money to employers that have suffered 10% declines in revenue to pay their employees. It looks a lot to me like the PPP program that we're all praising right now. And by the way, it's my understanding is that it's been employed with some success in countries like Australia, New Zealand, maybe in Israel, hardly left-wing places. But I have a different concern about the program, which has been a larger concern I've had with the efforts that we've made across the board with PPP, with many of the efforts on the part of the Federal Reserve, including the primary and secondary purchases that they are making. This has been other than the unemployment insurance and the direct grants to individuals, this has been a very business-oriented recovery. And I understand the attraction of trying to help small businesses, but the reality is, as Mr. Perlmutter said, an awful lot of businesses are going under anyway, already have and certainly will. And that's not a happy thing, but there is a process of bankruptcy that often will keep a business operating and people employed while a company rejiggers its capital structure. So my question is, and let me start with Professor Stiglitz on this, and if I have time, I'd like to maybe hear from Dr. Cook and Mr. Zuluaga. But why should we not be focused at delivering money directly to the individuals who need it? In other words, if you're unemployed, you get money. If you never had a job, you would get money. When you go business focused, PPP, an awful lot of people will have paid their lease payments, will have paid for insurance. God only knows a lot of the efforts of the Federal Reserve are there to make bondholders whole. So, Professor Stiglitz, let me start with you. Why should we not reorient around what is clearly to me an obligation to the government, which is to keep American citizens, not businesses large or small, but to keep American citizens directly whole as efficiently as we can?
I agree very much with your overall sentiment, and I think congressional response has to have a balance. But let me explain why I think the Paycheck Recovery Program is a good way of helping, because maintaining the link between the worker and his firm is important for the recovery. We know that when that link gets broken, the recovery will be impaired. We also know that our unemployment insurance scheme system has not been able to manage well this constant surge of newly unemployed. People have had to wait weeks and weeks to get the money. We also know, as I mentioned in my talk, that America, more than these other countries, workers depend on employer-provided health insurance. And if they get disconnected with their firm, they then go on Medicaid or on very expensive COBRA provisions. And so this is actually an efficient way of delivering money to a lot of lower income individuals. Remember, the way the program is set up, it only goes to people whose income is less than a certain amount. You could obviously jigger that amount. So it's actually directing money via an efficient, you might say, administrating process to low income, middle income workers who need it very well. So it actually uses the existing set of relationships to disperse money. That's the way to think about it.
So thank you, Professor. I appreciate it. Mr. Zuluaga, I've only got 30 seconds, but you caught my attention because you were sort of arguing in favor of direct aid to individuals. How do you respond to Professor Stiglitz's value placed on maintaining the employer-employee connection for purposes of health insurance, training, et cetera?
I think in specific circumstances, it's very important, particularly when you have short-term disruptions and you have very few other changes to the underlying structure of the economy, because then that intangible capital doesn't get destroyed by whatever's happening around it. But increasingly, as time goes on, and as people start making decisions about their future lives on the basis of the experience, those relationships become no longer sustainable, regardless of what you do with funding.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Mr. Gonzalez, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Cleaver. Thank you, everybody, for your testimony today and on this important topic. I want to start by commenting. I don't know if this was intentional. I think I've heard a couple times that maybe we shouldn't be so focused on business bankruptcies, and I just fundamentally disagree with that. I think we need to be focused on bankruptcies, period, whether it's a house in the household sector, in the business sector, or the government sector. Having bankruptcies in any of those sectors on a massive scale, I would argue is net negative for the recovery and just in general. But I want to start, Mr. Stiglitz, with a question to you. So in your testimony, your written testimony, you have a comment here: we need to provide income contingent loans where repayments and the duration of the loan automatically adjust to the circumstances of the economy and the firm. I think that's an interesting concept. it is different from HR 6918. I'm just curious, could you flesh that out a little bit for me? What do you mean specifically there? How would you see that administered? Just kind of drill down on that for me if you could.
Good. Well, thank you very much for the question. The point I'm trying to emphasize that no one knows the course of this pandemic, as we've seen. We thought in the beginning it would be very short. We're now going through a very difficult time in certain states. We don't know whether back in New York we'll have another wave. So there's a lot of uncertainty. And we want firms and households to begin to spend as the economy recovers. But one of the things that's going to dampen that spending is they don't know what's going to happen. There's not. So what I'm proposing is that there be a lending program, but a program that says, look at if there's a second wave, or third wave, fourth wave, a perpetual wave, we'll suspend your payment conditional on state of the pandemic, and it can be made very state specific, national specific, but it builds in an automatic stabilizer, gives them some certainty. Some of the things that we're talking about, restructuring in response to the needs to social distance, some of the investments that we needed. This would encourage them to do it. And then if it turns out they have to shut down anyway, they would say, okay, you don't have to make a repayment until the economy starts going again. It really gives the flexibility that we need.
Thank you. And then Ms. Garcia, a question for you. So I share the goal of needing to support first off, our state and local governments, but also in particular our schools, so that we can get our children back in the classroom safely. In your proposal, you talk about $170 billion in the Education Stabilization Fund, $56 billion for PPE. Can you just walk me through kind of where those numbers came from? Because I'm somebody who believes if we don't get our kids back, I mean, the economy is going to suffer, but boy, there's some massive long-term ramifications there. But we need to do it safely. So just expand on that if you could.
And thank you for that, because finally I heard someone say we have to open schools safely, and it will cost some money. We have 4 million more or less folks that work inside those schools, and that's the teachers, the paraprofessionals, the school principals, the counselors, if you're lucky enough to have a school nurse. So we've looked at that. We've looked at the cost of what it costs for a hospital to buy the protective gear that you need. I will tell you, it's probably a low ball, because we also need. I used to ask parents if they would donate Kleenex, toilet paper, and soap. We always run out of soap for the kids' bathrooms. Now we're going to need something much more sophisticated to disinfect and sanitize. There's no budget for that. And the most expensive part is going to be, we've thought of some very, very creative ways that you can distance kids. But it means you have to creatively use the space, the library, the gym, or you have to look at split sessions. And that means you might have to run the school buses twice a day instead of just that one round trip. So we've put all of that into the calculation of what we're going to need just to maintain what we have right now. And like I said, it's probably on the low side.
Great. Thank you. And I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Sherman for 5 minutes.
Thank you. And Mr. Chair, thank you for your opening comment about how apparently by mishandling COVID, we might be able to persuade Mexico to build the wall. While we're talking about spending money and getting the economy going, I want to put in a strong pitch for the $5 billion in the HEROES Act for doing the research necessary to ameliorate this disease. As it happens, our professional medical researchers are at home because all the non-COVID research projects have been suspended. And every time I ask a medical researcher or a medical expert about this disease, how is it transmitted, et cetera, the answer is always, well, we need to research this, we need to research that. There is no better way to fight the economic effects of COVID than to actually defeat the disease. Part of that would also be to make sure that everybody has enough sick days. It's very easy to tell people stay home if you have a fever, but we provided funding for smaller employers to have sick days, but everybody needs sick days, and some people used up their sick days on other illnesses. Professor Stiglitz, when I first got here, we were all taught, we got to Congress, the focus was on the enormous federal budget deficit, that deficits cause inflation, that they cause high interest rates, and yet the inflation is running lower than we want it to. Interest rates are so low that savers are very frustrated. And we can avoid future interest on the debt if we monetize the debt. That is to say, we have the Fed own the debt instead of issuing it to the public. The world seems to have an insatiable desire for US dollars. Can we, is our thinking outmoded on deficits? Can we spend trillions of dollars, monetize the debt? That is to say, have the Fed own it instead of selling it out to those who would expect interest payments, and get through this crisis.
Yeah, I'm not worried about the deficit. The interest rates are very low. Servicing the debt doesn't cost, it costs essentially nothing. And as you said, history shows that the enormous increase in the balance sheet of the Fed after 2008 did not cause any inflation. So when you go to war, you don't ask the question, can we afford it? And we're at war with this virus, and we have to win this war, and we don't want our economy destroyed as we're fighting the virus. So I don't think you have really any choice. At the same time, you want to spend the money well. And that's why I think the Paycheck Recovery Act is really a good bill, because it actually targets the money very effectively. It doesn't spend billions of dollars in paying the banks to administer the program, which I view, and administer it in a way that the money goes to those who are well connected. It doesn't the recovery program can disperse money very, very quickly. So to me, I do worry always about spending money well. And one of the things I like about this particular bill is that it seems to actually have been very thoughtful about getting money where we need it and get a big bang for the buck.
Ms. Garcia, I think you've done a good job of illustrating why we need more funds for our schools to be able to reopen safely. I'd point out also that many schools, particularly here in Los Angeles, will not open in August, and they need technology for home learning. And while that's happening, you need a lot of money to reopen. You need a lot of money for distance learning. While we have those increased costs, we have a tremendous decline in revenue for state and local government. So I would like to ask whether the $90 billion state fiscal stabilization fund grants to support state funding of education, the HEROES Act, is helpful, and to what degree is it sufficient?
We've asked for 175 billion, for an extra 4 billion for technology and the E-rate. And so to answer your question, we need everything we can get. And the thought of not getting any help at all. If you just gave us what you gave Shake Shack, that would be a beginning. You know, that's what I'm thinking, is this is no different. We are talking about massive layoffs. We're talking about your public schools facing, are we able to open with any plan? And we can't do it without extra resources. We just can't.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Hood. The chair now recognizes Mr. Timmons. You're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you holding this hearing, and it's good to see you all, even if it's on video conference. I was going to end my remarks talking about debt, but given the previous questions, I'd like to also begin with it. The cost of our debt last year is $593 billion. Next year, I would imagine that we're going to spend more on our interest payment on our debt than on the entire Department of Defense budget. So debt is not free. It does come with a cost, and it's something that we need to be mindful of. That said, it is not the time to pinch pennies. We need to get help to the people that need it. We need to get help to businesses, and we need to get help to individuals that have lost their jobs. Those two endeavors are not mutually exclusive. As the owner of multiple small businesses, I have a gym, a yoga studio, a real estate development. We are very fortunate that we've had a good year last year. Between our cash reserves and the PPP loan that we got, we are likely going to make it. I say likely because if this goes past April, May, if we don't have a vaccine before then, we probably won't make it. I have a number of small business owners that have reached out, and they have said if we reclose the economy, they will just file bankruptcy. They have to close up shop, and it is a reality that a large percentage of small businesses will not survive this. And it's not right that the government has shut everyone down. I realize that we had to flatten the curve, slow the spread, but we need to get help to the businesses that have been affected by this, and we need to get help to the individuals that have lost their job. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. And I look forward to the conversations around the Phase 4 legislation. Obviously, there does have to be a component of business liability protections. If you tell a business they can reopen, and then you tell them they're going to get sued because they reopened, even though they're following best practices, that's not consistent. So we need to reopen, but we got to do it safely. Mr. Zuluaga, I would like to hear your thoughts on Phase 4 legislation and what you think is the most effective way to get that relief to those that need it most.
Sure. Thank you for the question. I think focusing the business support on the areas that are shut down or have experienced a second wave is very important, because that's where the supply shock is happening and where the help is going to be most useful. Besides that, I would focus on incentivizing re-entry into employment. I think some of the protections you mentioned to businesses that are getting back into business and want to do so safely and want to buy the protective equipment and so forth is important, so that there's no legal uncertainty. But in addition to that, I would say if there is going to be spending on supporting demand generally, it should be unrestricted. It shouldn't be conditional on business regulations and on businesses taking on new regulatory burdens that didn't exist before. I think that's the wrong approach, because right now we face a lot of uncertainty, and businesses particularly face a lot of uncertainty about the future, and they need that flexibility.
So you would agree that the additional $600 in unemployment insurance benefits that those that lost their jobs have received, perhaps we need to have a more surgical method to facilitate workforce reentry, to encourage workforce reentry?
I would indeed focus on incomes. I would look at how much people are earning, and below a cutoff, I would suggest some financial support regardless of their employment status, rather than boost unemployment benefits, because I think there can be a disincentive to work, and it can cause people to become more and more removed from the labor market, which we don't want.
And just to be clear, I want to help these people, but we have to get back to work, and we need to do it in a strategic and surgical way. I think the CARES Act overall was great, but there were a lot of shortcomings that we could have modified the approach, and it would have had a better impact, and it would have helped people, and it would have helped businesses. And again, I think that's the whole point of Phase 4 legislation. We got to be very intentional about helping those that need it without casting a larger net. And like I said, I'm going to end the way I began. $7 trillion is what we probably have spent thus far. We're going to have $30 trillion in debt by the middle of next year, if not shortly after that. We can't keep spending money that isn't ours. It is our children, it is our grandchildren's money. Now is not the time to pinch pennies, but now is also not the time to spend recklessly. So we need to make sure that our dollars have the effect that we want. We need to get people back to work, and we got to do it safely. And I'm just praying for a vaccine in November and December as opposed to April. So with that, Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding this hearing, and I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Vargas for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Well, thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and the ranking member. I appreciate it very much. When I first came to Congress, I sat on the Agriculture Committee, and the Farm Bill was up that year, and they wanted to make deep cuts to the SNAP program. Of course, I was very much against that and argued against that. That's the old food stamp program, and I happen to quote the Bible, Matthew 25:33, where it says, you know, if I was hungry, you gave me to eat, and went on and on. But anyway, a colleague of mine from Tennessee took issue with that, and I think he quoted 2 Thessalonians saying, you don't work, you don't eat. But anyway, what I didn't know in that conversation, that was my friend from Tennessee had received $3.6 million from the federal government for his farm and his family's farm. So the New York Times pointed that out the next day, and I went and had a conversation with him. I said, you know, I find it somewhat hypocritical that you don't want us to feed hungry people, and yet you put $3.6 million of government money in your pocket. I mean, how do you balance that? And he said, well, we're a business. And they're just people. I said, oh, okay, I understand. Okay, that's his view, and that's his view, and that's fine. Now I'm on this committee, and I've heard people pontificate lots of times about the TARP program, saying, oh, no, let the businesses sink. Never should subsidize them. If they can't make it, let them sink. Yet that view has changed somewhat now, some of my colleagues, and I think that that's good. But it seems to be the same thing. They don't mind putting money in the hands of the businesses, but when it comes to putting that money in the hands of the people that need it, the employees, there's a problem. I think that's what this bill basically does. It says these people are unemployed. We got to help them. Professor Stiglitz, am I wrong on that? I mean, and the ideology says, well, because this is socialism, we're against socialism. I mean, I've been to New Zealand, I've been to Australia. It seemed very socialist to me, but maybe I'm wrong about this. Could you comment?
No, you're absolutely right. I've talked to government officials in many of these countries, and these are not radical countries. This is not Venezuela or anything like that. These are middle of the road, center left, center right governments, by the way, in which there is cross the board support for these programs. And it's that cross the board support that has created a kind of solidarity that allows the disease to be curbed because they respect each other, trust in government, and as a result of curbing the disease, the economy is back. And that really echoes what Lily said. If you have a safe environment, people can go back to work and you can go back to school. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I agree. I did want to ask Ms. Garcia, though, I got to tell you, I'm very much in favor of reopening the schools when it's safe. The reality is that not only do children get educated in the schools, but it also helps the parents with childcare, to be frank. A lot of people can't work if their kids can't go to school. That's what I hear from my educators here in San Diego and from school board members. They want to open the schools, but they only want to do it safely. And yet, they're constrained because they get money from the state government, and if the state doesn't have the money, they can't help out the schools. Could you comment on that?
It's not rocket science. It is basic adding and subtracting. We are being told, school boards are hitting the panic button. They're being told all over the country, do not expect what you thought you were going to have next year. Start cutting your budgets. We already have people who are getting pink slipped at a time when we need all hands on deck. There is no other funding source than the federal government. We cannot hold a bake sale and hire people back. If it was bad for business to have massive layoffs, how can it not be even worse to have massive layoffs of the people, the only people who can open schools safely. So that there are some folks that don't see how that connects, that you can't open schools safely if you don't have enough people and you don't have the supplies that you're going to need to do it. Let's do it safely. We can do it.
I agree. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Taylor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Really appreciate this hearing. Thank you for everybody being here. I just want to kind of take us back a little bit and think about the economic step that we as a federal government took toward our economy. We basically put our economy in a coma, basically went to a shelter in place strategy really across the country, and then took a series of steps to try to when we go into put the economy in a coma, what do we need to do? Well, one of the things we did is we did the PPP program. We increased unemployment benefits. We did a series of different programs. We're absolutely massive in the trillions of dollars across the board. Another thing we did that I think was really important is we forbeared on mortgages, and we did that basically in two ways. One was going to the Fannie and Freddie by statute and telling them you need to forbear people's home mortgage payments. Obviously, if people aren't working, they're not earning revenue, they can't make their mortgage payments. And the second way we did that is by going to the banks through the OCC and creating guidance for them that said, hey, you guys can forbear on your mortgages, right? So those two steps were really massive and really allowed about a little over $30 trillion of debt in this country to forbear. A place where we have not seen forbearance is in the real estate space. And so particularly the collateralized mortgage-backed security market, they have not been given guidance from on high. The federal government hasn't passed legislation. They haven't really taken a step to allow or encourage them to forbear. I think that they feel some market pressure to do that, some public pressure to do that, but we're not really seeing that. A group of 105 members, and many of you who are in this hearing right now, were part of this, signed a letter to the Treasury and to the Fed, encouraging them to come up with some kind of facility, probably using their 13(3) authority, to encourage forbearance on commercial real estate loans so that those properties are not foreclosed. And just so everybody's clear on what we're about to see, I think we're about to see a wave of foreclosures starting this fall, going into next year, that some analysts estimate will be 2 or 3 times worse than anything we've ever seen before. So it's very serious. It's coming at us at a relatively quickly pace. In other words, it's going to happen so fast that by the time we were to pass a law today, it'd be very difficult for it to be implemented fast enough to forbear on all the different pieces of foreclosures that are coming up. So my question, Mr. Zuluaga, is do you think that getting mortgages in a place where they're forbearing while we're putting the economy in a coma makes sense in order to try to keep things going for the other side? We get to the other side of this from an epidemiological point of view.
I think it can work. There is a risk that you will get delinquencies accumulating at the end of the period. And this is something that we're still uncertain about with regard to Fannie and Freddie, for example. So they have had forbearance for a long time. And actually the forbearance rates, even though the take-up was high, the actual mortgages and forbearance are much less than most of us expected, which is good news. I think forbearance can help, but so long as we don't have much certainty around when the recovery is going to take place, we really then hiding delinquencies as forbearances and potentially defaults, and eventually when foreclosures are again allowed, that may happen again.
Sure, and I guess as part of this conversation, it's important to being from Texas, Dallas, Texas, we remember the RTC days, right, when the Resolution Trust Corporation through the FDIC went in and programmatically foreclosed every property that was in default and then just liquidated it, and it really collapsed values within that market. It was a very brutal experience for everybody involved and really harmed a lot of jobs. I think that's the important thing here, is that particularly in the hospitality space, of the first 24 million Americans that lost their jobs, 6 million were working in hospitality. And so that industry has been really, really injured, very harmed. It's going to be a while till it recovers. And so if we could give them a liquidity bridge to get to the other side so they could start paying their mortgage. So they can pay. We lend them money to pay their mortgage. I was talking to one hotel operator yesterday who was looking at the legislation that we're working on. I've got a member of this committee will work on filing that bill later this week. And he's saying, look, without this bill, I'm probably going to lose every single property I own. With this bill, I probably can keep every property that I own. What's important about that is that means they can pay the money back and that those jobs will be saved. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. San Nicolas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this very important hearing. For me, I sit back and I observe the discussions and I listen to the ideas and I look at the recommended policy provisions that are being put forward. And I think that one of the first things we need to reconcile is somewhat of the undertone of our witness testimony here today. And that is the question of whether or not we really view this current set of circumstances as something that requires permanent adaptation, or are we looking at a white squall event that we just need to get through in order to return to a place of normalcy in our economy and in our daily lives. And Mr. Zuluaga, you mentioned that a lot of the necessary adaptation, that was a phrase you repeated over and over again, that businesses need to adapt. And I'm a little concerned about that because right now the adaptations that we're seeing, for example, are 50% occupancies in restaurants. We're seeing lines being drawn on sidewalks, leading into businesses, keeping people apart. And I'm worried that if we adapt in a way that results in permanent changes, that we're going to actually hinder our ability to recover. And so I wanted to enter into my comments with that context, because as we all know, our economy in this country is predominantly consumer driven. But the consumer, what they need in order for them to be able to have the confidence to drive our economy with their own spending is they need certainty. Any kind of uncertainty paralyzes them. And right now, while we've done a good job as a Congress putting forward stopgap measures, it hasn't done a lot to ameliorate the uncertainty of our consumers when they look out 3 months, 6 months, 1 year ahead. On July 25th, our eviction moratoriums are going to expire. On July 31st, the extra $600 in FPUC is going to go away. On August 8th, the PPP is no longer going to be available. And so when we have all of this uncertainty out there, it's going to make our consumers afraid of spending the money that we're even providing now. And so I appreciate my colleague's bill that we're kind of discussing here today, because it kind of helps provide a sense of certainty for our consumer. But I think one of the biggest things on the horizon for a lot of our consumers is how are they going to pay for their housing? And I wanted to thank my colleagues for moving HR 7301 recently to try and address the housing concern. Dr. Cook, I really appreciated your testimony. You came at us with a lot of hard data and information that was very concrete. I'd like to focus in on more on what you mentioned earlier about the 20% evictions that we're looking at having to deal with on September 30th. If you can elaborate more on that and potentially what that might do in terms of a domino effect spilling over into our housing, a second housing crisis that we've been through in 2008.
Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Okay. Thank you for your question. So yes, this is something that I'm certainly concerned about. 20% of rental households face eviction by September 30th, and as you know, there are moratoria everywhere, but these are coming to a close now. And this is happening in the fourth largest city in America, in Houston. And, these courts are working through these cases. So I think this is certainly something that has to be taken quite seriously. And what we know is from the surveys of homeowners, of renters and of homeowners, 44% of Latino renters and 41% of African Americans won't be able to pay their rent. So that's somebody's mortgage that's not going to get paid. And a multifamily home, for example, a multifamily mortgage that won't be paid. So there's about 40% of those mortgages are Fannie and Freddie mortgages, but there are a lot that aren't. And even with these being covered by Fannie and Freddie, there is a problem of enforcement. The individuals have to figure out whether these mortgages are Fannie and Freddie mortgages. So there is a lot of danger, I think, ahead if this isn't straightened out now.
Thank you, Dr. Cook. And real quick, Dr. Stiglitz, we saw that the housing crisis was created back in 2008 from a bottom-up problem. I'm sorry, a top-down problem in the debt. Is it possible that we can have a similar bottom-up problem with these renters not being able to pay?
Oh, very, very much. Whenever you have a major crisis like this, it spreads throughout the economy, and even good loans turn out to be bad, and you can wind up with a problem in the financial system, which is has actually identified
Mr. Chair.
stress.
Thank you, Dr. Stiglitz. The chair now recognizes Ms. Wexton for 5 minutes. Ms. Wexton, you need to unmute your. We'll proceed with Mr. Garcia, and we'll come back to you, Ms. Wexton, if you can. Mr. Garcia, you're now recognized for 5 minutes. Ms. Wexton,
Thank you, Chairman Cleaver and Ranking Member Hill for convening this hearing on a bipartisan proposal. I'm referring to the Payroll Recovery Act, as it has support from across the aisle in both the House and the Senate. And this discussion about protecting workers' paychecks is urgent and badly needed for my constituents here in Chicago and for working class communities like mine across the country. From what our panelists have shared today, and thank you for joining us today, it sounds like we haven't done enough in Congress to help ordinary people during this crisis and to prevent a deeper collapse. Unfortunately, I'm not surprised because many people in my community are getting more and more worried. Wall Street got the guarantees they needed, but my neighbors are in a very precarious situation. The additional unemployment benefits provided by the CARES Act expired this month, and so did the bill's protections against eviction. Many businesses in my district that were supposed to close temporarily are now announcing permanent closures. I've lived in my neighborhood for 50 years, and I was stunned by the scale of suffering and loss that my community has faced during the great financial crisis of 2008, 2009. We had barely started to recover from that crisis when COVID-19 hit. The questions for the panelists. President Eskelsen Garcia, you mentioned a looming crisis facing our public sector workers. Many of my constituents are public sector employees and even more rely on teachers and social workers, nurses and librarians every day. Cuts in public services fall disproportionately on communities like mine. Can you talk about the cuts that you're hearing about at the bargaining table and how those cuts will disproportionately affect poor and Black and brown communities across the country?
I've heard from people from Hawaii to Wyoming to New York to Florida. Everybody is alarmed by either school districts saying we have 4 third-grade classes of 32 kids. We're going to not replace the third-grade teacher who's retiring, and so we will redistribute those kids, and we will end up with 40 kids or more in a classroom. Or they're saying we're going to lay off the band teacher, we're going to lay off the foreign language teacher, we're going to lay off counselors at a time when we need every single person to help us open those schools safely. They are facing budget cuts that will mean massive layoffs in every community. This will ripple through the economy and have the double effect of saying something that people say is essential to getting people back to work, a healthy public school open will be almost impossible to accomplish. In some areas, completely impossible to accomplish.
Thank you. For Mr. Stiglitz, the COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated how connected the world is, but also how disconnected the response to the virus has been in different countries. Unfortunately, I think the virus could expand the gap between richer countries and poorer countries, and the burden of additional debt on countries in Latin America, for example, could slow down our global economic recovery. In April, I introduced the Systemic Risk Mitigation Act to support an IMF issuance of special drawing rights, better known as SDRs, to help countries access the currency they need during this crisis. I was glad to see that Senator Durbin introduced a similar bill in the Senate last week. Professor, do you worry that our global economic downturn will get worse without some form of international stimulus? And do you think special drawing rights would help?
Yes, we live in a very interconnected world, and a downturn in the rest of the world will inevitably affect us a great deal. And right now, Latin America is one of the hot spots. And so the downturn there will have a big effect on us. I very strongly have been advocating a special issuance of SDRs. There's already, if the United States supported it, they can issue $500 billion. Wouldn't cost American taxpayers a thing, but it would be of enormous benefit to American citizens because it would be a boost to our economy as it helps the rest of the world and would help us in our diplomacy enormously.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Wexton, are you able to get in now? Ms. Wexton, you're recognized for 5 minutes. We still can't hear you.
One more question, if you don't mind.
Mr. Porter, Ms. Porter, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. Mr. Stiglitz, in an April 2020 Roosevelt Institute report, you identified 4 design problems with the PPP. And I'd like to talk about those because one of the most common questions I get is, why support a paycheck recovery, paycheck guarantee approach if we've already done the PPP? So I'd like to spend our time kind of trying to answer that question. In your Roosevelt Institute report, you mentioned the randomness of who was going to get helped. And we certainly saw that some industries got help while others got left behind. Industries like construction and professional firms that weren't very impacted got PPP loans, while other industries that are really suffering got left behind. Second, you mentioned that those who were best connected, most likely to know about the program, were more likely to get relief. That certainly happened. And Congress went back and tried to adjust the PPP loan by setting aside money for some of our community lenders to try to address that. I want to pick up on the third thing that you identified as a problem with the PPP, that the Paycheck Recovery Act would take a distinctly different approach. You flagged the introduction and the use of banks as intermediaries in the PPP as a problem. What's the problem with having lenders be intermediaries, and how is the Paycheck Recovery Act different?
That's a great question. The point is that having the banks as the intermediaries meant that those who were most connected with the banks got first in line. And I saw this very vividly. I have friends who were small business owners, but very small. And they called up their bank and they couldn't get an answer. And there were others who were very well connected. And that couldn't get it wasn't just random. It was some sectors that were very badly affected didn't get as much money as some sectors that were not very badly connected. I also pointed out that we were paying the banks an awful lot of money to administer it. So in fact, our taxpayer money wasn't going to where to the small businesses, it was going to the banks.
Yeah, so I mean, as I look at it, we paid the banks an average fee of around 1%. I mean, it's something in the neighborhood of $6 billion, taxpayer dollars that went to these banks for a loan program in which they took on no credit risk and did no assessment of the applications. So it just seems like that $6 billion could be buying a lot of actual help for American families right now. You also raised concerns with the PPP's lack of clarity and transparency, and I have been pushing hard with regard to making more data about the PPP transparent. Can you tell me why you think the Paycheck Recovery Act would be more clear and more transparent and could avoid some of the problems and abuses that we've seen with the PPP?
So the basic idea of the Paycheck Recovery Program is it's defined by clear rules who can get access. You just apply, and if you're eligible, there's a set of eligibility criteria. You know exactly what the formula is, and so it's available to everybody, not first come, first serve. It's available to everybody who meets certain criteria. So we know, whether you're a minority or not, you get it. On the other hand, when you go through the bank, it depends on who has the connections with the banks. I've been very disturbed that it took a suit under the Freedom of Information Act to get the information about where the money was going. We as citizens should have the basic right without having to sue to get that kind of information.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things I want to highlight for everyone who's listening is, and for my colleagues, that the small businesses across the country agree with these concerns about the PPP and recognize that a Paycheck Recovery Act remains a necessary step to helping make sure that we're keeping people on payroll. When I talk to constituents, they don't want to be on unemployment. They don't want to be applying for these programs. They want a paycheck. They want to be able to continue to make ends meet for their families. They want to know they're going to have a job to go back to. That's the help that they're looking for. They're looking for help in continuing to get that paycheck and have that dignity and provide for their families. So I just want to flag and enter into the record, Mr. Chairman, if you would allow me, I'd like to submit an April 29th letter from over 30 national, state, and regional small business organizations calling for the passage of the Paycheck Recovery Act, as well as an op-ed written by Mark Zandi.
Without objection.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Wexton, you are now recognized for 5 minutes, I hope.
I hope that I am now unmuted.
Yeah.
I'm not. Woohoo! Yay! Huzzah! Well, great. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses for coming before us today. I want to touch on the issue of expanded unemployment benefits a little bit more. As has been noted, they're set to expire on July 31st. And in my home state of Virginia, the weekly unemployment benefit is only $378. So it's not the lowest in the country, but it's a lot for a family. It's not enough for a family to live on. So the additional $600 a week provided by the CARES Act has been a huge benefit to people just to be able to pay their rent and their car payments and things like that. But many are claiming that this benefit is way too generous. Larry Kudlow, one of the president's economic advisors, says we are paying people not to work and that we are disincentivizing people to not return to work. That's a lot of double negatives there, but I think he's saying that it's too much money for people, that they're living large on $600 a week. And we are hearing from various talking heads that employees are refusing to come back to work because employers are struggling to bring people back to work because of this extra $600 a week. Now, we had Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell before us a couple of weeks ago, and I asked him about this very question. I asked him if he was seeing anything in the data or in business activity surveys that supported this claim. And he said that he did not see anything like that. And he opined that more likely what's happening is that people in service economy jobs are more reluctant to go back to work because they don't feel safe, because they're likely going to come in contact with a lot of people, and a lot of them are not going to be wearing masks because that's not mandated in a lot of places, and a lot of employers are not requiring that they do so. And that's pretty consistent with what I'm hearing, as well as people who are having trouble accessing childcare. Many childcare centers have closed and they don't have those options anymore. So And it's not just in the service economy that jobs are lost. From April to May in Virginia, we've seen thousands of jobs lost across sectors, including 1,300 manufacturing jobs, nearly 2,600 healthcare and education jobs, 5,900 state government jobs, 15,000 local government jobs. And Ms. Garcia, you mentioned the 900,000 public education jobs already lost nationwide because of local budget cuts. Now, those people don't have the option of returning to work, even if they wanted to. So, Ms. Cook, Professor Cook, do you think that now is the time to pull back on this enhanced unemployment support?
Absolutely not. If we're learning the lessons of 2008, 2009, now is the time to augment that support, not to withdraw it, because we'll be looking at even higher unemployment numbers. There are still 19 million people receiving unemployment benefits. This is unprecedented for the modern era, for the post-1940 era. The unemployment rate is 11%. So this is not the time to withdraw support from state and local governments, especially given the health crisis. The health crisis is not over. And all of these hospitals, the healthcare providers, they need the support. We're going to need a lot of mental health support once this is all over for people to be able to go back to work. I think that that's been underrated and has been underestimated. People are going to need a lot of support to be able to go back to work whenever that happens, whenever it's safe to do so.
Professor Stiglitz, do you agree that it's not the time to pull back on that support? I mean, it would be wonderful if we could maintain that employer-employee relationship, but many people are not going to have that option. So what is your position on these enhanced unemployment benefits, whether we should let them expire?
I agree very much with Professor Cook. I don't think we should allow those to expire. The fact is that with a high probability, we will have significantly elevated unemployment levels for a long time. And in many, many states, the basic levels of unemployment insurance are among the poorest in the Western world. And the coverage doesn't cover a lot of people. And that's one of the things that you did in the CARES Act is extend the coverage. So both in terms of the amount and the coverage, both of those were deficient, and you address that in the CARES Act.
Thank you. And you guys are in good company, because one of the things that Chairman Powell indicated was that he thought that resetting that to zero would have an extremely detrimental effect, not only on the economy as a whole, but on our recovery. So thank you very much. And with that, I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We apologize for the technical problem, whatever it was. Ms. Garcia, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for allowing me to join you in this very important hearing. I've been listening, and it just reminds me of some of the debates we had at the beginning of all this, where we were trying to figure out, where do we start, what do we do, and we focused on making sure that we address the health pandemic, because no matter what, we still have to address the health issues, make sure our hospitals are ready, the frontliners, they're working at the hospitals and providing the care, and the research that's necessary to find the treatment. And then we decided to make sure that we put money in people's pockets, like Mr. Heim said earlier, and to make sure that they were able to buy the things that they needed, which is why we had to support businesses. So I think you can't do one without the other. They're so connected. That I want to focus on the need for the Paycheck Recovery Act, because I know that in my own family, it took my brother maybe 3 weeks of calling and online applications and et cetera to even get on unemployment insurance. And then he loses benefits. He loses his longevity pay. He loses so much. So I think there's still a need for us to take a serious look at the Paycheck Recovery Act. And I wanted to start with Ms. Garcia. Every time I heard your being addressed, I looked up because I thought it was me. But you signed on to a letter, Mr. Chairman, that I would like to ask unanimous consent that it be submitted to the record. A letter supporting the Paycheck Recovery Act. And that clearly said that, we know there's been 3 packages, but there are still layoffs. economy's still in a free fall. Working families are still hurting. They're worried about putting food on the table. They're worried about their rent. You know, they need a paycheck. They need a job, as my colleague,
Without
Representative
objection.
said. Thank you. Do you continue to believe that the relief packages passed by Congress so far are insufficient, given the scale of this public health and economic crisis?
Is this for me?
Yes,
This
ma'am.
is um,
From one Garcia to the other.
Gracias. I kept thinking too, there's a couple of Garcias on here. Great name. But I don't want to say that it's enough. Give us this, and life will be rosy. This is a beginning, and we know we can't do what we have to do with less, and we're facing our funding falling off a cliff. So this is something that can at least stop the bleeding. And we're willing to be incredibly creative about what we can do, but we will not be able to open schools in so many districts in a safe way without some significant help. And as was said, we've already lost, since this pandemic began, almost 1 million support staff. These might be the bus drivers, the paraprofessionals who aren't delivering instruction with a Zoom call the way a teacher is. They've just been told you don't have a job, like everyone else that's been told you don't have a job. They are.
So we may not get them back, but they would have stayed on payroll as the Paycheck Recovery Act would do. That would be most helpful. So do you feel like workers still need the payroll recovery act?
Yes, I do. And part of it too is, yes, the workers that I represent, but their family members, and by the way, our students and their parents who are out of a job. Anything that impacts a community impacts that child and that school. So this is more than just the teacher or the bus driver. These are the parents of our students who are just trying to put food on the table.
Yes, thank you. Now I have a question for Mr. Springsteen. Is he still there? I can't. There you are, Mr. Is it still skis? What are your thoughts on the Paycheck Recovery Act? Do you think there's a need for that today, as states are still struggling? I know my state in Texas is reaching a crisis point. My city of Houston. Do we still need a Paycheck Recovery Act?
Is that for me? Yeah,
Yes.
Very much so. One of the things that I emphasized is that the previous CARES Act wasn't comprehensive enough, didn't provide enough support to the state and localities. And it was so clear that the revenues of the states and localities would plummet. And with the balanced budget frameworks, they were going to be strangled. And they provided essential services, education, health, welfare, and the suffering that would result, and the macroeconomic effects. It would be, I call it in my testimony, austerity from below, which would have large multiplier effects. And it would mean that we would not have a robust recovery. So it is, in my mind, absolutely essential. We need not just businesses, but also the state and local communities, educational institutions, research foundations. It's not just businesses that are having a hard time now.
I agree. And Mr. Chairman, I do want to, if I could, I would like unanimous consent to enter a April 29th letter to Speaker Pelosi from 100 economists supporting the Paycheck Recovery Act.
Without objection.
Thank you, sir. I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the witnesses for their testimony today. Without objection, I would like to offer a letter of support for this hearing provided by the National Association of Federally Insured Credit Unions, a submission for the record by the Washington, D.C.-based think tank Third Way, and a number of letters of support for legislation reauthorized and funding the Senior Investor Protection Grant Program. Without objection, all members have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able, and without any objections. All members have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. I remind members to submit written questions and materials for the record to the email address provided to your staff. There are no further comments or questions. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everybody.
Aye.